Welcome, everyone. I am Takatoshi, Director of the Program on Public Pension and Sovereign Funds at the Center on Japanese Economy and Business, also known as CJEB, at Columbia Business School, and Professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Thank you for joining us for Day 3 of our 2022 Tokyo Conference. The Day 1, the day before yesterday, we had a fascinating keynote and panel on security and diplomacy. And yesterday, Day 2, we had a truly informative keynote and panel on diversity and inclusion. Today's webinar will feature a pre-recorded keynote and a live panel discussion. Our keynote speaker is the Honorable Takayuki Kobayashi, Economic Security Minister, Science and Technology Policy Minister, and Space Policy Minister of the Government of Japan. Minister Kobayashi joined the Ministry of Finance in 1999 and served as Secretary at Embassy of Japan in the United States from 2007 to 2010. He was first elected to the House of Representatives in 2012 as a member of the Liberal Democratic Party and has been elected 4 times consecutively. When Mr. Kishida became a Prime Minister last October, Mr. Kobayashi was appointed to be a minister in charge of economic security. This was the first time that economic security explicitly became a cabinet post. But even before the Kishida administration started, Mr. Kobayashi, as a member of LDP, worked hard to put economic security at the top of national policy priority. So he knew exactly what he has to do from day 1 of his ministerial appointment. Unfortunately, Minister Kobayashi is unable to join us in person today due to the scheduling conflict with the diet. He was kind enough to join me on Zoom last week to give his remarks and answer a few questions of mine. I truly look forward to sharing his remarks and our discussion on Japan's economic security policy with you all. Now, please enjoy.
皆さん、こんにちは。日本の経済安全保障担当大臣の小林孝之と申します。本日はコロンビア大学のこのカンファレンスにお招きをいただきましてありがとうございます。伊藤孝俊先生はじめ関係者の皆様に感謝申し上げますとともに、今回講演の機会をいただいたことにも心からお礼を申し上げます。当日にどうしても動かせない予定がございますので、大変恐縮ですが、事前収録ということで行わせていただければと思います。パネルディスカッションも本来参加させていただきたかったんですが、非常に残念に思っております。これから私自身が個人として作った資料を使いまして、20分ほどこの経済安全保障について説明をさせていただきまして、その後、伊藤先生との意見交換をさせていただければと思います。それでは始めさせていただきます。はい、私は今政治家として、日本を世界をリードする国にしたいという思いでやっています。でそのためには日本の国力を上げていかなければいけないということで、今ご覧いただいているのは私の頭の中にある国力のマトリックスです。やはり国家戦略の根幹となるのは人の暮らしを豊かにする経済と国民の命を守る安全保障、この2つが根幹にあると思います。そしてこの2つを車の両輪として回していくんですが、経済安全保障を共に下で支えているのがイノベーション。そしてイノベーションを生み出すのも人ですし、イノベーションの成果を世の中のためにどう使うか、それを決めるのも人なので、一番下にはエデュケーション、人づくりを置かせていただいています。その中で今、経済と安全保障が融合する領域が増えてきております。これはコロナ禍でサプライチェーンの脆弱性が露呈をいたしました。マスクがなくなった、医療用ガウンが消えた、あるいは今 半導体が不足しているような状況です。また、世の中の社会のデジタルトランスフォーメーションが進んでいますが、便利になることはいいことですけれども、サイバー攻撃のリスクというものも当然高まってきています。また、技術が非常に複雑になってきています。これまで私たちが使っているインターネット、あるいはナビゲーション、この GPS も含めて、もともとは米軍、アメリカの軍用の技術から民生に転用されましたが、今は逆に量子や人工知能、あるいはバイオ、この民生に活用される技術が容易に軍事転用もされうる、そういう融合領域が増えてきている状況でございます。そもそも私がこの大臣になる前に自民党、日本の与党自民党の中で経済安全保障の議論を政府に先立ってリードしてまいりました。その時に自民党の提言の中身を書かせていただいてますが、その中で経済安全保障の定義につきましては、我が国の生存、独立、そして繁栄を経済面から確保することと定義しました。またそのための基本的な概念として戦略的自律性と戦略的不可欠性という概念で整理をいたしました。この戦略的自律性について簡単に申し上げますと、これはさまざまな産業についてさまざまなリスクシナリオを想定をし、それによって各産業の脆弱性というものを把握をし、それを克服していく。これが戦略的自律性というふうに捉えています。また戦略的不可欠性というのは簡単に言えば我が国の強みを把握をし獲得することでございます。技術を含めて他国に対する優位性を獲得し、それをさらに磨いて国際社会にとって日本が必要不可欠な分野を戦略的に拡大していくこと、この自律性と不可欠性を獲得していくことを基本的な概念としています。また技術についても極めて重要な点ですので焦点を当てさせていただきました。その中で一昨年の年末に自民党の提言としては、特にこのエコノミックセキュリティコンプリヘンシブローズとありますけれども、経済安全保障に関する法律を2022年、すなわち本年成立させるべきだということで提言をし、今政府としてそのような方向で動いています。で、今回国会審議でも問われました。そもそも経済安全保障の推進法が5月の11日に成立をいたしましたが、この国会審議におきまして、これはアメリカ合衆国のやっていることを後から追っているだけなのではないかというお話もありましたが、ここはバイデン政権になって去年の2月にサプライチェーンの強靭化の大統領令が出されていますが、事実関係として申し上げますと、それに先立つ形で我が国としてもこのサプライチェーンの強靭化を含めて経済安全保障のさまざまな取り組みについて問題提起をやってきたということでございます。アメリカとの連携も当然重要ですけれども、まずは我が国として我が国の国益という視点に立って経済安全保障について考えてまいりました。また自民党の提言の続きですけれども、先ほどの自律性の確保というところについて申し上げますと、去年の1月から半年間ぐらいかけまして、政府と協力する形でここに書かれているその基盤産業、エネルギー、情報通信、交通、海上物流、金融、また医療ということで、この5つのこの産業をインフラを選んでさまざまなリスクシナリオを想定をし、何が対応できて何が対応できないのか、脆弱性の把握とその対策というものを考えてまいりました。その中でさまざまな課題が浮かび上がりましたが、例えば基幹インフラの機能維持のための安全性、信頼性の確保ですとか、サプライチェーンの強靭化というものも当然出てきたわけであります。そうしたこの作業を踏まえて経済安全保障に関する法案を作っていくという流れになりました。 で一方で、この強みの方である優位性、不可欠性の維持、強化、獲得については、技術に焦点を当てて、さまざまな提言を昨年の5月に出させていただいております。たくさんあるんですけども、いくつかかいつまんでここに出させていただいてますが、技術の保全という視点と技術の育成という視点、また経済安全保障を進めていく上での体制の強化という形で、自民党の提言をまとめさせていただきました。その中で本日は技術のところにフォーカスを当てて少しお話をさせていただきます。今世の中では経済のグローバル化が進んで、イノベーションは当然オープンにやっていく。またデータ駆動型社会を迎えています。でこうした大きな流れというものは当然日本としても支持をしているわけでございますが、その中に副作用が出てきております。そうしたものにどうやってバランスよく対応していくのかということが重要でございます。でこの技術の優位性や不可欠性というところにつきましては、技術を守るというところと、技術を育成してその強みを獲得していく、その2つの側面があると考えています。まずその技術を守っていく、その仕組みについて、最近の日本がやってきている課題についてご紹介をさせていただきます。まず1つ目が、いわゆる外為法と呼ばれるものでございます。特に対内直接投資の管理を最近見直しました。法改正を行いまして、この基本的には外から海外から投資を呼び込んでいくということは日本としての大方針でございまして、ここに変わりはありません。ただし、国の安全を損なう恐れのある投資への、海外からの投資へに対しては、適切に対応していかなければいけないということで、リスク管理を強化をしました。この上場会社の株式取得のこのシュレスフォードを域値を 10% から 1% に下げるということで管理を強化していますし、また投資審査を見ていく体制につきましても、国内の体制を強化しているところであります。そして次に、外国政府からの研究試験の受け入れ、また技術流出防止のためのこの留学生などの審査の在り方について簡単にお話しさせていただきます。これ今アメリカではその中国のいわゆる1000人計画を対象に、この優秀なこの米国の研究者が中国に雇われるような形で技術流出がなされるのではないかという懸念が議会を中心にその懸念が高まっていると認識しています。さまざまな議論がなされていると承知しますが、我が国においてはアメリカと違って特定の国を念頭に置いているわけではありません。しかしながら、例えば去年の12月にガイドラインを改正しました。これは何のために行ったかというと、例えば研究者の方が日本の研究費を公的資金を申請したときに、例えば利益相反となりかねない外国政府からも資金をもらっている場合は、それをしっかりと報告をするように義務付ける、そういうガイドラインの改正を行いました。研究インテグリティの強化でございます。また、外為法の強化というところで、これはいわゆるみなし輸出と呼んでいるんですけれども、そもそも外為法というのは、クロスボーダーの取引を管理するものでございます。で、一部例外的に国内の取引であっても、居住者から非居住者へのこの機微技術を渡すということについては、非居住者はいずれ海外に出ていくということで、これも既存の外為法のこの管理の対象としておったんですが、この非居住者というのは、6ヶ月間日本の国内に滞在すると、自動的に居住者となって外為法の管理の対象外となります。しかし、こうした方の中にも、一部外国政府の方とほぼ一体となって動くような方もいらっしゃるので、そういう方については、外為法の管理の対象とするということで、この技術流出防止の観点から強化をいたしましたし、また留学生、あるいは海外からの研究者、もっともっと日本に来ていただきたいと思います。それによってイノベーションを起こしたいと思いますが、 ただし、その一方で、この受け入れする際の審査の体制は同時に強化していくということで、やらせていただいています。そして4つ目としては、研究開発成果の公開の在り方ですけれども、具体的に申し上げますと、この2つ目のこの印の方の特許の非公開制度の在り方につきまして、今回、法律の中でも手当てをさせていただきました。当然、特許というのはイノベーションを推進するものです。先に発明された方の権利を守りながらも、それを公開することによって、多くの方々にさらにその発明の成果を活用していただいて、新しい発明をしていただく、そういうものですけれども、公にすると、公開すると安全保障上、極めて問題がある大きい場合には、ほとんどの国で一部非公開にするという例外的な措置を設けておりますが、これまでG20 の中で日本とメキシコとアルゼンチンだけがそういう留保なく、すべて特許出願すると公開という制度になってましたが、極めて対象を限定する形で、今回安全保障上の要請に応えることといたしました。次にデータの話でございます。21世紀の石油と呼ばれるデータですから、このデータをいかに集めて、そして解析して利活用していくのか、また同時に個人情報の保護という要請もあります。このデータの利活用の在り方について各国がデータ戦略を設けています。私の問題意識としては、我が国としてもデータの保護ともに同時にデータをどう利活用していくのか、もっともっと積極的にやっていかなければならないと感じています。特にそれぞれの産業分野についてオープン、クローズのルール、何をオープンにして何をクローズにするのかというルールをしっかりと日本としても作っていく必要があると考えておりますのと、あと民間企業はどんどんグローバルに活動してもらいたいと思いますが、このデータに関するデータの管理については各国で法律や慣習などのルールが異なりますので、グローバルに活動していただく日本企業については、当然そのデータの管理の在り方についての各国の制度の違いというものを念頭に置いてしっかりやらないと、場合によってはその虎の子の技術のデータなどが既存する恐れもあるということで、そこは気をつけていただきたいと考えております。最後に営業秘密の保護というところでございますが、数年前に日本においては不正競争防止を改正しまして、この罰則の営業秘密の漏洩に対する罰則の水準を引き上げましたが、いまだにこの漏洩事案というものは増えています。これは一義的には企業の中でのこの課題だと認識しておりますが、重要な機密の保管方法ですとか、あるいは機密へ誰がアクセスできるのか、そうしたことをしっかりと考えていく必要があると思っています。そうした中で、今、最近、我が国として、講じてきた、この技術の保全に関する守るというところに焦点を当ててきましたが、これから残りの時間で技術を育成するという点についてもお話しさせていただきます。ここにアメリカ、中国、日本ということで、それぞれ各国が技術に関する国家戦略を立てています。ここに書いてある人工知能やバイオ、データ、あるいは量子、半導体など、それぞれ重要分野がございますが、このどこで、どこに勝ち筋を見出していくのか、これは極めて重要な課題だと認識をしています。今回の経済安保推進法の中でも、この技術を見極めて、その強み、その日本が勝負すべきところに官民が協力して、しかも国としても資金をしっかりと投じていく枠組みを今回法律上手当てしたところでございます。その中で今いくつかこの重要技術分野を例示させていただきましたが、今日本の国内で一つ大きな関心を呼んでいるのが半導体産業の在り方についてです。ここのグラフにある通り、1980年代後半、日本は世界トップのシェアを誇るような半導体産業でしたけれども、今は 世界の1割を切るという水準になっています。ここについては様々な反省の材料がございます。しかし、今回、これからの世の中で半導体というのは当然重要になってくるわけでございまして、日本としてどうこの半導体産業を再生していくのか考える局面に立たされています。半導体産業のこの製造プロセス全体を見たときに、今、日本が特に強みを持っているところは、素材と製造装置のところだと考えています。そうした我が国が強みを持つ分野にさらに磨きをかけていくということが重要だと思っておりますし、またこれからデータ駆動型社会になっていきます。カーボンニュートラルを追求していきます。当然、そのデータの通信量というものは激増しますし、それに比例して消費電力も激増していく。その中で電力を制御するためのパワー半導体、ここについても非常に重要になってくると思います。日本が強みを持ち得る分野の一つだと考えておりまして、現在はシリコンが主流ですけれども、やはり効率が悪い。ここに書いてあるように SiC 炭化ケイ素ですとか地下ガリウム、こういう素材が出てきてその実用化が近づいてきています。日本はこういう素材の分野強いですし、右下にありますけれども、その先には素材として酸化ガリウムですとか、そのさらに先にはダイヤモンド、さまざまなこの素材が新しく出てくる可能性がある中で、日本の強みというものを官民が一体となってさらに研ぎ澄ましていく必要があると思います。また半導体産業については、今日本の弱みというのは、先端ロジック半導体の製造拠点が国内になかったということでございますが、先般、台湾の TSMC が九州地方に投資をするという決断を下されました。日本政府としては歓迎しておりますが、さらにその先を見ていく必要があると思います。いわゆるビヨンド2ナノの次世代半導体についても同時に戦略を作っていかなければいけません。日本一国でどうにかなる話でもないと考えておりまして、アメリカを中心としたパートナーとしっかりと連携をしていく、ウィンウィンの関係を作っていく必要がありますし、さらにその先を見据えて、例えば日本が強みを持っている光電融合のような技術をどう生かしていくのか、これについても同時並行で研究開発を国として民間と歩調を合わせて進めていく必要があると思っています。重要なことは、この半導体産業一つ取ってみても、足元だけを見るのではなくて、少なくともこの先10年間ぐらいは見据えた上で、しっかりと S 型を書いていく。また、今、具体的な数字はあえて申し上げませんでしたけれども、じゃあこの10年間で国としてどれだけ投資を行うか、コミットするか、そこをしっかりと国としての強い意志を見せていくことによって、日本に残っている民間企業や技術者の方たちが本気になれるかどうかが決まってくると思っています。現在、この半導体については萩生田経済産業大臣の下で戦略が練られておりますけれども、日本としてしっかりとアメリカとも連携しながら勝負をかけていきたいと考えております。で、まとめますと、今、日本がやろうとしていること、最近やってきたことは、この自律性をしっかりと確保し、この優位性、不可欠性というものを獲得していくこと、このために先般、経済安全保障に関する法案を提出し、5月の中旬に成立したわけであります。この法律について若干、説明をさせていただきます。4つの柱からなっています。4つの柱、サプライチェーンの強靭化、そしてこれは黄色の部分です。で、上から3つ目の水色の部分のこの先端的な重要技術の官民協力の技術開発の在り方につきましては、支援の枠組みでございます。で、2つ目と4つ目、このまずオレンジ色のところは、基幹インフラの安全性、信頼性を確保していくこと、サイバーのところを強化していくというところにメインでございますけれども、また先ほど申し上げた特許の非公開制度が4つ目の柱でございます。どちらかというと、この2つは規制の側面が多いと感じております。本日は時間の関係でこれ以上詳細な説明は省きますけれども、 最後に私から申し上げたいことは、経済安全保障を我が国として進めるにあたって、最後3点、ポイントを申し上げたいと思います。一つは、こうした法律も重要です。今回重要な一歩を踏み出したと思いますけれども、それはあくまで取り組みの一部でしかありません。まだまだ重要な取り組みというものはございますので、法整備を含めて積極的に進めていきたいと思います。これが一つ目です。二つ目は、やはり経済安全保障に関して、我が国自身の基軸となる考え方を打ち出していく必要があります。今、法律が成立した後、私が直面している大きな課題は、岸田総理が新しい国家安全保障戦略を策定すると言っています。そこにこの経済安全保障の視点をどう位置づけていくのか、これが極めて重要だと思っております。最後に3点目、これはメディアが一部報道をするんですけども、経済安全保障は規制ばかりではないかという報道が一部にありますが、私は明確にそれは違うというふうに否定をします。当然、規制の側面もありますけれども、先ほど申し上げた通り、経済活動は自由です。これが大原則。また、アカデミアの方の研究活動も自由。これも大原則でございます。また、国ができることは限られていて、メインプレイヤーは企業であり、アカデミアの方だと考えています。したがって、規制をかける場合であっても、予見可能性を確保しなきゃいけないし、企業への負担というものをできる限り少なくしていかなければならない。これは当然でございます。いずれにしても、規制の側面に加えまして、先ほど申し上げた先端技術の育成を含めて、あくまで経済成長を目指して、経済安全保障を位置づける。こういう思いで、私は担当大臣として経済安全保障の政策をこれからも進めていきたいと考えておりますので、こうした機会をいただいたことは非常に感謝しておりますし、また積極的に国内外に発信をさせていただきたいと思います。とりあえず以上で終わらせていただきます。どうもありがとうございます。
はい、小林大臣、大変に情報量の多いプレゼンをどうもありがとうございました。また、小林大臣が取り組まれてきた経済安全保障推進法が5月11日に成立いたしました。先ほど大臣からお話があった通りです。おめでとうございます。早速、いくつか質問させていただきたいと思います。プレゼンの中にありましたように、今回の経済安全保障推進法では4つの柱があるとされています。で、重要物資の供給も強化、インフラの安全確保、官民で先端技術の研究促進、非公開特許制度の導入ということであります。すべて触れることはできませんので、時間の関係上、いくつか私の関心を含めてですね、お尋ねしたいというふうに思います。で、一般的にその技術を守るという場合に、日本が持っている技術がその外に流出しないようにしないといけないということで、いわば対立国への技術移転、あるいは漏洩というものをどう防ぐかということになるので、そこに対する投資を規制するということにやはりなるのではないかと思うんですが、そのあたり、どういう方向に行くか、お尋ねしたいと思います。それから、その中に来るものですね、外から体内投資をする、日本で重要な技術を持っている企業をテイクオーバーするというようなことに対して、大臣のお話にあった通り、外為法が2019年に改正されて、対処の方針が揃ったようには見えるんですが、ただ、なかなかこれだけで十分なんだろうかという意見もありまして、アメリカのシフィウスのように、その投資の事後であっても、売却命令ができるようにしてはどうかと、そういう強力な法律が必要なんではないかという意見もあると思います。この小林大臣におかれては、この改正外為法で十分だというふうにお考えなのでしょうか。この対外投資の点と、それから対内投資の点、2点、よろしくお願いします。
はい、まず先ほど申し上げました通り、企業の経済活動とアカデミアの研究活動というのは自由である。それは大前提だと考えております。したがって、何かその取り組み、技術流出の対策をするにしても、これは非常に重要だと思いますけれども、 こうした経済活動などを大きく阻害することがないようにするということが重要だと思っておりまして、この安全保障の確保と自由な経済活動をどう両立させていくのか、これがポイントだと考えております。そうした観点から技術流出の防止につきましては、先ほどプレゼンさせていただいたように様々な取り組みやらせていただいておりますが、その中でまず対外投資につきましては、そもそもその国際情勢の変化に伴うその安全保障上のリスクの変動というのは、なかなか予測することが難しい面もございまして、例えば他の国が関心を持っている対象で、その技術の対象であるその我が国の企業ですとか、あるいは研究機関、こうした技術の先端技術の流出につながるような対外投資というものが仮にあるとすれば、政府としてはビジネスの予見可能性と両立する形で必要な対策を取っていくことになろうかと思います。ただし、今はその対外投資というよりも、伊藤先生が今ご指摘されたような対内投資の方に重点を置いて対策を講じてきたというのが事実関係として正しいと考えております。で、先ほどちょっと触れさせていただいた先般行った外為法の改正につきましては、市場の要請とまた安全保障をどう両立させていくかということで、かなり知恵を絞ったつもりです。で、その中でまずはこのシフィウスというのは私の理解によると、その事後的な規制を行うこともある、そういう立て付けだと理解しておりますけれども、今日本としてはまずは外為法を改正して、それを今しっかり運用しているところですので、そこをまずしっかりやっていきたいと思っています。また昨年、先ほど説明をしなかったんですけども、昨年の夏にですね、日本のこの対内直接投資の政府の中での審査体制というものを強化しました。これはアメリカのシフィウスを参考にしたところもございます。それまではその財務省が中心、財務省とその企業を所管するこの省庁がバイでやって、あくまでバイの関係だったんですけれども、シフィウスのように関係省庁は合議体を組んでいく。他の経済産業省や国土交通省や総務省やさまざまな省庁でこの合議体を作って定期的にこの情報を共有していく仕組みも作っておりますので、そういう意味ではこの現在作ったこの枠組みをしっかりと運用していくことで対応していきたいと思いますし、令和4年度の予算におきましてもこの投資審査の体制を人員を70名ほど強化をいたしまして、特に地方のこの省庁の出先機関、日本でいう財務局や経済産業局を強化をして、しっかりとそのモニタリング体制も強化していくということでやらせていただいております。
ありがとうございます。次にですね、その供給網、重要物資の供給網の強化というところで、そのコストがかかると思うんですけれども、そのコストをどういうふうに誰が負担するのかというところまで踏み込んで考える必要があるのではないかという質問です。で、今までそのジャストインタイムの供給網でやってきたけれども、これはちょっとどっかで地震があると途絶えてしまうとか、どっかでその、コロナが流行ると供給網が寸断されてしまうというようなことで、今考え方としてはジャストインタイムではなくて、ジャストインケースというような余裕を持ったリダンダンシーを持ったものにしようという方向に動いているんではないかというふうに私は捉えているんですけれども、そうすると当然コスト増が発生する。で、どっかに在庫を持つというのは、その在庫にコストが発生するわけですし、その重要な物資については海外依存を減らして国内回帰するということであれば、やはりその国内回帰でコストが上がるんではないかと考えられるので、そうすると、やはり企業に補助金を出すんだろうかと、そうすると納税者に負担が当然いくわけですけれども、あるいは製品価格に転嫁できるのか、メイドインジャパンといえば、その何円か高く売ることができるのかというようなことを考えてしまうわけですけれども、 この強靭化に伴う経済コスト増というのはどのように誰が負担するというこのことについて方針というのはあるんでしょうか。
まず今、伊藤先生がおっしゃったサプライチェーンのグローバル化につきましては、これなぜグローバル化が進んでいったかというと、当然、各企業が経済合理性に基づいて、その企業活動を展開していった結果ですね、それぞれの企業の視点から見れば、経済合理性にかなうその行為であったんですけれども、国全体として見たときに、その供給途絶リスクを内包するような、そういう仕組みになってしまった面があるということだと考えています。実際にその重要な物資について供給途絶が実際にリスクが顕在化してしまった事案があるということも認識をしている中で、今回法的な手当をさせていただきました。で、その民間事業者というのは、当然そのサプライチェーンの強靭化を図ることによって、その生じるコストと、逆にその供給途絶が起こってしまった場合に生じるこのリスク、そのリスクでこれを低減することのメリット、このコストとメリットを比較する形でその企業行動を決めていくんだと理解しています。で、こうした中でそのサプライチェーンの強靭化にあたって発生するコストというのは、最終的なそのユーザーに至るまでのこのサプライチェーン全体の中で、そこは吸収されていくものだと認識をしています。ただ、そのサプライチェーン全体の中でコストが吸収しきれないと見込まれるときには、結果としてそのサプライチェーンのその強靭化の取り組みが行われないという結果を招きますので、今回、この法律を作ることによって、例えば外部に過度に依存し、あるいはその将来的に外部に過度に依存する恐れがある重要な物資につきましては、あくまで民間事業者の取り組みを支援するというそのスキームを今回作らせていただきました。で、それでもどうしてもそれやっぱり民間企業の方が国が支援しても手を挙げないというケースについてはもう国が前面に出ていくしかないと思っておりますが、そういう形にしてますので、国が強制するものではなくて、あくまで民間企業の自発的な取り組みの後押しをさせていただくということと、あとはじゃあどうやって強靭化するかという手法についても、これ民間企業に任せたいと思っておりまして、これは例えば国内の生産基盤を強化するというのは分かりやすいですが、その他にも供給源を多様化するというやり方もあるし、備蓄をするというやり方もあるし、代替物資を開発するという枠組みもあります。短期的に見れば、そのコストが増えるということも考えられますけれども、例えばその代替物資を開発することによって、それまでそのチョークポイントであった、ある意味弱みであったものが代替物資の開発に成功すれば、それを世界に展開して強みへと変えることもできるわけです。したがって、このサプライチェーンの強靭化っていうのは、必ずしもそのコストだけが中長期的に見てコストだけがとにかく増えるというものだとも私は必ずしも思っていなくて、それが経済成長に十分つながるところもあると思いますし、あとはその仮に短期的に納税者としてのコストが仮に増えたとしても、それを仮にやらなかったとすれば、その供給途絶が起こったときに、国民経済に対してはものすごい甚大なコストが生じうるというふうに考えておりますので、やはりこうした取り組みをする際には中長期的にやはりそこのコストとベネフィットのその比較考慮というものをやっていく、そういう視点が必要だと考えています。
ありがとうございます。そのあたり非常に重要な点だと思いますので、国民に分かりやすくコミュニケーションを取って、納得してもらうということが重要だと思うんですけれども、そのあたりをぜひ大臣によろしくお願いしたいというふうに思います。
はい。ここはいろいろ物資を特定していくときに、当然民間の有識者の方を含めてしっかりと意見交換させていただきながらやっていきますので、説明責任はしっかり果たしてまいります。
ありがとうございます。他にも聞きたい質問たくさんあるんですけれども、残念ながら時間が過ぎてしまいましたので、これにて、小林大臣による基調講演と質疑応答を終了したいと思います。小林大臣、本当にお忙しいところ、どうもありがとうございました。
伊藤先生、ありがとうございました。
It was truly wonderful to hear from Minister Kobayashi and speak to him last week for video recording. Now, I'd like to move on to a panel discussion today. And panel is on economic security and features three illustrious speakers. The Naoshi Hirose is Vice Minister for International Affairs at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI for short. He had served at METI for over 35 years with extensive experience in the field of trade policy. He leads all of METI's international policy operations and represents the ministry in cross-border economic dialogues, negotiations, and he travels alongside the Prime Minister on overseas mission to advise on economic trade and industry and energy policies. Daniel Price is Managing Director and co-founder of Rock Creek Global Advisors, an international economic policy advisory firm, where he focuses on international regulatory and policy matters. Mr. Price currently advises multinational companies and financial institutions on trade policy, financial regulatory issues, geopolitical risk, and matters arising in global forums, including G7, G20, and APEC. Candida Wolf is Executive Vice President and Head of Global Government Affairs at Citigroup, where she oversees international, federal, state, and local government relations for Citi. Prior to joining Citigroup, Ms. Wolf was a partner in the legislative and policy practice at the law firm of Hogan Lovells, where she represented clients in legislative matters before Congress and administration. So now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Hirose to start our panel. And Mr. Hirose, the mic is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ito, for your very kind introduction. And I'm also very pleased to join today's conference, which touches on a very, very important topic these days. And I'm very pleased that I can join the conference with my good friends, Dan and Candida. And since Minister Kobayashi in his opening remarks has touched on a detailed and comprehensive explanations about Japan's overall policy on the economic security, I would try to maybe provide you with some perspectives of how to look at this in the context of the international community or international relations. And I think we are right now in the midst of a big challenge to the international order, and I think everybody knows that this challenge has not begun with the Russian invasion to Ukraine. It stems from much before, and we know for example that with the confrontation between the United States and China, we are talking about how to confront authoritarian states like state capitalism or data protectionism, which could lead to surveillance societies. We are in the midst of a huge digital transformation, which transforms our whole industrial structure, how to do business, and how our society is formulated. And on top of that, I think, with the COVID-19 pandemic, which began 2 years ago, I think there was a tendency that many countries tended to look inwards and also tend to embark on a policy of a kind of me-first policy. An example for that is that many countries introduced some kind of export restrictions on critical goods, and that then other countries were not able to get them. And then we have further global issues like the climate change or the human rights issues, based on common values, which we have to address. And on top of that, in February, we are facing the challenges of the Russian invasion to Ukraine. And so, I think we can say that we are in the midst of a crucial change in geopolitics. And so when we talk about the global supply chain, I think we were accustomed to a situation that goods or people or money or data will transfer cross-border, and the location of production or where we procure certain goods and so on, the business decisions were primarily based on efficiency. But then we have realized these days that there were huge risks hidden. And with the new crisis, these risks became apparent. And what we have seen in the latest trade crisis is that every country has realized right now that it is huge risk when we depend critical goods, including energy sources like gas and so on, to certain sources. And that can put our security, our survival, our freedom of policy choice in jeopardy. And we're already seeing, that some countries have policies of economic coercion, by which, those countries are trying to put certain countries under influence or under control. So that means, that we have to have strategic autonomy, as Minister Kobayashi has mentioned. And I think there are two aspects of that. One is, that we have to cope with the risk that there are disruptions to the free flow of goods and money and data and so on due to heteronomous factors like the pandemic, like regional wars, regional conflicts, or policy changes of governments who like to use economic coercion and so on. This is one aspect. The other aspect will be, that there is a need in order to maintain our security, maintain our technological superiority, that as a policy, governments have to embark on restrictions of flow of goods and data and technology and so on. And there is, I think, a need for international coordination among like-minded countries. And I think, in some cases, it's the first case, in some cases, the second case, maybe in certain cases, both two aspects are relevant in some cases. Next slide, please. And so I think, and here I think, the common approach is that, for critical goods and technologies and so on, we have to reduce our dependence on certain sources. And what I would like to call it is that we have to establish a certain trusted value chains, a value chain that we can trust among countries which share common values. But I think, the important thing is that we don't make a mistake about how we design the trusted value chain. Because I think, there could be a tendency or thinking that we deny the global economy or globalization or free trade principles per se, and try to do everything in their own country, reshore everything to their country, or embarking on a kind of me-first attitude and aim for an exclusive bloc economy. I think, politically, there might be some temptations toward that. But I think, if we close ourselves to the outside world, then innovation will stop. And that will, in the long run, will counterproductive to our economic or our security. And so I think, what we have to do is distinguish between, cases and look at, the nature of the supply chain risk. For example, if you look at emergency goods like medicine or ventilators or masks, and there was a shortage about these goods, after the COVID-19. And but this situation was primarily that, because of the pandemic, the demand for these goods skyrocketed. There was an explosion of demand, and the production capacity just didn't catch up to that. So it doesn't mean, that there was necessarily a disruptions of supply chain. The demand was too high. But for the other goods, like for example, auto parts, electronics, and so on, This is a case, where in ordinary cases, the supply chain is globally intertwined. And so we have seen instances, for example, where a company has relied on the supply of wire harness to one factory in a specific country. And because of the pandemic, that factory was closed. The production of the finished car was stopped as well. The other other case is that for some energy resources and critical minerals. This is a case, where the location of these energy resources and minerals are geographically unevenly distributed around the globe. And so when there is, for example, a conflict in the Middle East, then there is a scarcity of supply. And the other aspect is that there are certain cases for critical technology where there is need as a policy for strict control for security reasons. So I think there is so we have to look at what kind of products we are talking about, and what the risks are, and what policies we have to embark on. That depends on each case. And so I think the bottom line is that we have to have a good system where we can incorporate necessary measures for economic security while allowing legitimate international transactions and businesses. Because I think otherwise we will risk of undermining our innovative strengths and the competitiveness. And so I would like to call it as upgrading global supply chains and free trade, not denying global supply chain free trade. And so I agree with Minister Kobayashi, that the basic thing is that we have to free business activities is, I think, the basis of our competitive strength. Next slide, please. And so that means, that very good coordination among countries is essential. And I think, when countries have different policies without coordinations, that will undermine the predictability. For example, if some countries embark on unnecessary export restrictions to lock in, their goods, then it will break off, the global supply chains. Or, for example, if certain countries like the United States or China escalate the application of extraterritorial application of their export control, then again it will reduce, the predictability for the business sector. Or some kind of import restrictions due to human rights issues. This is certainly a legitimate thing to think about human rights, but if the business sector doesn't know what to do, then it will only discourage or shrink business activities and doesn't lead to real protection of human rights protection. And also we are seeing, for example, Europe is embarking on some kind of CBAM to avoid carbon leakage. But if it is not designed in an appropriate way, then it could lead to disguised protectionism. So I think, I think international coordination is very, very important. And here, I think, there are several aspects where international coordination is important, like industrial technology policy for critical goods or technologies, good coordination on export control and investment screening, and global rules for data governance, what to do about market distortion practices like industrial subsidies, and how to avoid carbon leakage. I think all these kind of issues, which are linked to economic security in a broad sense, I think a good coordination among like-minded countries, and especially a good coordination between Japan and the United States is very necessary. So in this context, I would like to explain a little bit of what has been discussed at the US-Japan leaders meeting and the Quad's leaders meeting earlier this week. Next slide, please. There was the Japan-US leaders meeting on Monday this week. And what has been discussed there is protecting and promoting critical technologies, including export control. This is, I think, one of the core issues, that we have to coordinate. And on the semiconductor, we have agreed to establishing a joint task force on the semiconductor, next generation semiconductors. And that has been discussed between Minister Hagiura and Secretary Raimondo of the Commerce Department at the Japan-US Commercial and Industrial Partnership. earlier this month. And there was a recognition, that the Japanese side has approved the economic security promotion bill that Minister Kobayashi has explained in his presentation. And we agreed, to further cooperate on strengthening the economic security. Next slide, please. It continues with, for example, starting a discussion about export controls on critical technologies, including microelectronics like semiconductors or cyber surveillance. And this is meant to address the misuse of such kind of critical technologies by malicious actors. It talks about semiconductor manufacturing capacity diversification. It talks about battery supply chain, critical minerals, and also defense of the critical infrastructure by sharing strategic information, and joint R&D for critical technologies. Now, to enhance the coordination between the United States and Japan, there is a new Japan-US Economic Policy Consultative Committee, a so-called Economic 2+2 established. This committee is composed of, on the US side, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Commerce, and on the Japanese side, the Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Japanese Minister of the METI. This is very important because I think we have to look at economic policy from the perspective of the strategic and geopolitical aspect. We had already the Economic 2+2 meeting on my level earlier this May in Washington, and we have aiming for a meeting on the ministerial level sometime in July this year. And finally, we have also established the initiative on clean energy and energy security, which is also very much linked to the issue about economic security. Next slide, please. Now at the Quad meeting on Tuesday, again, for example, on semiconductor, we have talked about that we are in the process of mapping our strengths and our vulnerabilities. Where are our strengths? Where are our vulnerabilities? And so that we can be complementary in our strengths, and so that we can cooperate in having a diverse and competitive market for semiconductors. Then we agreed on a common standard for principles on critical technology supply chains, and also we are working together on cybersecurity in this region. Okay. Next slide, please. So this is more or less, what we have done this week. Now, I would like to have one footnote about, how to engage the developing countries, because I think that's very important. And the reason why I'm saying is that if we, for example, look at, the issue with Russia's invasion to Ukraine, of course, G7 countries are condemning Russia for the actions of complete breach of international rules and so on. But we are also seeing, that the developing countries are not necessarily with us, and they're trying to maintain a neutral stance. And I think we have to understand, that this is their position is not necessarily, that they have the same kind of malice intentions like the authoritarian states, like Russia. But I think, they have to have this position because they have to survive. And because they have to survive, and they have to depend on certain authoritarian states for the economy, for trade, for investment, for technology, in terms of military purposes. And that is, I think, reality. So I think, what we have to do in terms of engaging the developing country is not necessarily to impose some pressure on that, to absorb, our values. But I think the more effective and good way is, I think, to provide alternatives, so that those countries don't have to depend on authoritarian states for trade, investment, infrastructure, and technologies. And I think, we have to provide tangible benefits to the developing countries. For example, assisting them for the digitalization of the economy, or for high standard, high quality infrastructure, or helping them with their energy transition to carbon neutrality, And so trying to address the real needs of the developing countries. And I believe that will lead to the economic security of the global community in a process. And finally, next slide, please. And finally, I would like to touch a little bit on the necessary investment, because I think we know that the critical goods and technologies in need for protection and promotion is primarily generated by the private sector. So we have to involve and engage the private sector. That's obvious. At the same time, as Professor Ito has mentioned in his questions to Minister Kobayashi, it requires some cost. And sometimes it's difficult to recover if it is left only to the market decisions. So there are cases for market failure. So I think a very good public-private coordination, including information sharing or dialogue between the public sector and private sector, I think will be very useful. And also a combination of private financing and public financing to cover up the risk if it is only left to the market. And that is, I think, a good partnership between the public and private sector for generating innovation, which I think is the ultimate driving force for securing energy security and economic security. And so this is, I think, the point where also a good coordination among like-minded countries involving the public sector and the private sector is very important to advance our interests. This is more or less I wanted to share with you. And once again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to make the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hirose. And Mr. Price is the next. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will do my best to stay within your allotted time, Professor. I second very strongly the sentiment of Vice Minister Hirose on the need for international coordination and cooperation. And I think this was on full display at the Quad meeting, the very successful bilateral meeting, and indeed the launch of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Economic security, of course, has two components. One is the coordination of domestic policies on competitiveness, industrial base, innovation. And the second is coordination of the international policies to meet common threats, whether those be a pandemic or a country or group of countries. And so coordinating those international policies on export controls, international investment reviews, strengthening and diversification of supply chains, as both the Vice Minister and Minister Kobayashi has said, are certainly all welcome. Let me sound, though, a note of concern about the term strategic autonomy, which has been employed both by Japan and by the European Union. I think for some good reasons and for some not so good reasons. In the case of the EU and perhaps Japan, because I noted, Hirose-san, your parenthetical about policy changes in government. I realize a lot of strategic autonomy has grown up in response to the belligerence of the Trump administration and its unjustified invocation of national security to against traditional allies to control or sanction trade. And so I understand the reaction to that, but I think time now is better spent on the coordination of international policies and focusing not on strategic autonomy, but strategic interdependence among the like-minded democracies. We've got a lot of challenges ahead. And the question is, will we succeed in establishing these trusted supplier networks? Will we succeed in coordinating our domestic policies and avoiding, for example, a destructive subsidy race to the bottom on support for our respective semiconductor industries? Will we coordinate? I think there's every reason to believe that we can. But this is where I think our efforts should be deployed. Finally, let me just congratulate Japan and Prime Minister Kishida for the successful bilateral, successful Quad meeting, for providing the impetus for IPEF, and for something else which the Prime Minister did, for which I'm very grateful. At the joint press conference with President Biden, he encouraged the United States to rejoin TPP, pointing out that IPEF is not an adequate substitute for TPP, nor is it inconsistent with the United States rejoining TPP. Because as Hirose-san, you said, we have to have a better globalization and a better free trade policy, but we should not be fearful of using the word trade. We should not be reluctant to pursue sound international free trade and investment liberalization policies, which have brought such benefits to the globe. I will pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. Next is Ms. Wolf. Candy?
Great. Thank you, Professor Ito and CJEB for the invitation to participate today. I represent, as you know, the private sector view at this panel, not to suggest that my colleague Dan does not, but he can perhaps say things that I certainly may not be quite so willing to echo, but do want to bring the private sector view. And I think what we'll see tonight is that the conversation that's already occurred within the panel, there's many similarities. But I do want to focus on that cooperation from the private sector around the unintended consequences of some of these actions. I think as you've seen, and I look at it from a Citibank perspective, you know, for decades, we've helped our clients finance the most efficient supply chains possible. That's what we heard the minister say, and the follow-up, and it's been about speed and it's been about costs as kind of the driving factor. And today, security and resiliency are really the buzzwords that are dominating the dialogue, as we've seen in this conversation with governments and with business leaders. And we sort of say that the S in the ESG discussion had been about social, but is now more about security. Whether it's energy security, it's food security, or it's economic security. I think many countries, and in speaking to the US in particular, these policies are being put forward that are restricting investment because of concerns around national security. But as we know, national security and economic security are now fully intertwined. And so as we look at the examples that we've seen, whether it's tariffs or in the case of the US, Section 232, or the use of Section 301, trade enforcement, whether it's the use of entity list designations for restricting exports, whether it's the use of sanctions, which have now been applied not only to individuals and to entities, but expanded to sectors and to services, whether it's the delisting of public companies, or in the case of the US, the question of outbound investment reviews, putting aside the fact that inbound has been, as we've talked about with CFIUS, part of the program for some time now. I'm not arguing that the objectives of security and resiliency are wrong, but mainly to highlight that, as you've already noted, this is an area that cries out for global dialogue, for cooperation, and for transparency. And I certainly welcome the minister's comments that technology and actions should allow business to be free and unrestricted as the underlying principle as we go forward. Because each idea in and of themselves have value, but in the collective, they may be disruptive and business craves predictability. If there's anything, understanding the rules of the road, the parameters in which you need to operate, then business can manage the economic interests within those parameters. To highlight just one point, in 2021, there were 9,421 sanctions designations by the US Office of Foreign Asset Controls, which is a 933% increase from the year 2000. There has been some recent studies that certainly suggest that transparency and multilateral consultations are necessary to minimize unintended consequence. And we saw that in the 2021 US Treasury Sanctions Review report. Finding that balance between economic security and national security is an art, I would say. It's not a science. If government overshoots, we create economic dislocation that can have unforeseen implications. And if we undershoot, then we allow financial activity that undermines our national interests. We recently, as our CEO was at the World Economic Forum, wrote about food security. And I think the point, again, and we've talked about this, that shifting to onshoring for food production or imposing export bans ignores the role that markets play in preventing food shortages. And we have to avoid protectionism in response to economic security concerns, or we'll end up with those unintended consequences of commodity prices increased and concern about economic downturn. So while we solve for certain problems, we need to take in the holistic approach. And I think there, I would just say that as we talked about the importance of having collaboration and private sector engagement, I think here's where the private sector can be a partner. We can help to explain what some of the unintended consequences might be as policies are getting implemented. So it should be collaborative. I don't think the private sector is looking to say, don't do any of these policies, just help be transparent, help us understand the accomplished, what goal to accomplish, and then we can talk about the best way to do that, that leads to and ensures that we have a free market and the ability to have a free flow of capital. And so with that, I think we can perhaps back to you, Professor Ito, for further discussion on this topic. And thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you very much. So we heard one round of the panelists, and it has a really broad topics in it. The audience, if you have questions, please use Q&A function and send us the questions, and I will try my best to pick up those questions. So going back to Hirose-san, as you heard from Dan and Candy, the American private sector perspectives, and quite knowledgeable about the government stance too. Do you see any similarities, differences between Japanese positions and US positions? And I think the CPS has been mentioned a couple of times that, and Minister Kobayashi mentioned that too, that does Japanese government think that more strong power is needed to protect the Japanese technology or crucial industries, or as Candy sort of emphasized that those any restrictions or regulations have to be predictable and transparent. And I think CPS is not known for the transparency and predictability. So how does the Japanese government see whether looking at the US, how is Japan different in approaching this economic security issues?
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ito, and thank you also very much, Dan and Candida, for the comments. And I think there's no fundamental difference between what our positions, because I think number one, we think that we have to have a effective set of measures for protecting and nurturing our critical technologies to be competitive for economic security reasons. That's number one. At the same time, as we have discussed, and as Minister Kobayashi also mentioned, that this is should not be meant to sacrifice, I think, the innovation that is happening in the business sector, and the virtue of market forces. So I think there has to be a balance, and I think there has to be a transparency and our targeted policy, so that the measures are actually targeted to those risks that we should address. So I agree that strategic autonomy should not be interpreted as reshoring everything, doing everything by ourselves, because that is impossible for almost all of the issues. So I think the word strategic interdependence that Dan has mentioned is, I think, also something that we can very much associate with. And I think I also agree that we have to be very careful that any measures that are in the name of security will not lead to disguised protectionism, because we have seen that in history. We have seen that in some countries. And so I think the important thing is that, as Dan has mentioned, is that there's no need and no kind of meaning of imposing measures among ourselves. Because I think, there might be differences, between, among ourselves. But I think, the important thing is that even if there are differences between ourselves, where we have to maintain solidarity, I think the bigger difference is what we are doing and what the authoritarian states is doing. And so I think differentiating with what we are doing and what the authoritarian states is doing, I think that should be, I think, the main focus of our measures. And also, secondly, I agree, that we should avoid a subsidies race. And that is also the reason, why we have been beginning to have a good coordination among like-minded countries in establishing a good ecosystems among like-minded countries on semiconductor production capacities and next generation semiconductor R&D, so that we don't put subsidies in the same thing. We have to be complementary, and also transparency is absolutely important, because I think every country is using industrial policy, but the nature of industrial policy, which is primarily market-driven and transparent, is different from what authoritarian states are doing. Now, on trade, I also agree, that we should not shy away from the word trade. Japan is well known that we would like to have the United States back rejoin the TPP, and I think despite the fact that we have to face the issue about inequality in the society and so on, which some corners in the society criticize that trade has been bad for the economic well-being of certain sectors or the workers and so on. But I think we can have a good policy, trade policy, to be inclusive. That could lead to good businesses that can contribute to the productivity of the middle class and so on. So I think there is much room for trade policy to function, and a good room for coordination of like-minded countries for trade policy as well.
Thank you,
Professor. I agree completely with Hirose-san that there is no necessary tension between, on the one hand, addressing the distributional and equity issues that have been raised and raised legitimately, and addressing restoring industrial competitiveness in a coordinated way, addressing economic security concerns, but also growing the pie. And growing the pie requires the continual removal of both new and old barriers, particularly, as Hirose-san says, if we want to engage developing countries in this broader effort to get them on the same page with like-minded democracies, there must be something in it for them other than a photo op at a signing ceremony, or to say that they're part of something. And so I have welcomed the efforts of Japan to get the United States to speak a little more clearly about its objectives in IPEF and some of these other matters. And I also look forward to Japan's G7 host year, where perhaps the efforts on data free flows with trust and the efforts at building trusted supplier networks which ground economic security can be reinforced.
Yeah, Dan, maybe just to sort of conclude and echo support. I mean, the business community in the US is attempting to come around to support IPEF, and, you know, in kudos, frankly, to Japan for the leadership that you've had on helping to move forward with this framework. I think Dan has sort of highlighted, you know, the challenges here in the US with certainly getting to an agreement that has some market access associated with it. But I would like to say that I think the fact that we've been able to move to get some sort of agreement and framework to begin those negotiations is critically important, because in many ways we may have to make this incremental. And as we struggle to sort of deal with the comprehensive challenges that have always come, incremental may be the best approach at this point to try to move the ball forward. And so I think just welcoming the dialogue, welcoming the structure, and trying to do and begin this process, I think in and of itself is a helpful exercise given where we were with TPP. So I'm encouraged and hope that, and as part of the business community, look forward to really trying to advance these discussions over the coming months and years.
Just 10 seconds to be clear, I'm delighted that IPEF has been launched, and I wish the parties much success in defining concrete objectives to turn it into a reality. So I am not at all negative on the fact that it has been launched. I am hopeful and cautiously optimistic that it will actually deliver results.
Yeah, but we have this sort of alphabet soup in the Pacific that we have now IPEF, but we had TPP, and we had APEC, which include Russia, RCEP, which US is not part of it, but there are many forums and groupings, but there is no sort of solid political economic organization like EU or NATO. So each used to be, you know, US is US has bilateral with Japan, bilateral with South Korea, bilateral with the Philippines in more security issues and economic groupings. We thought TPP would be a really good starting point, but US dropped out. And I'm a bit worried that IPEF would look promising, but may not at the end deliver what we want. Hirose-san, what do you think of this alphabet soup in the Pacific?
I think I agree. There are many alphabets in the Pacific Ocean. There are many alphabets around the globe, and of course, I think there has to be a kind of good synergy of different frameworks and so on, and not that we end up with something disorganized. But I think at the same time, I think maybe the difference between Europe and the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific region is that there is a lot of diversity among different countries in this region. And that is, I think, the reality. And also that is, I think, the strength of this region. So I think, maybe the reality that there are many frameworks and attempts, for economic integration and fostering businesses, investment in these regions and setting up roles is, I think, a reflection of the reality that this is a diverse region, but also has a lot of potential for growth. And if you look at the ASEAN countries, they would like to grow. And I think that is the reason, why we should make our efforts, that to provide with the IPEF with tangible benefits, that there is something for this region. So Japan has been advocating, that we welcome the engagement by the US in this region, not only in terms of security, but also in terms of economics. And I think, it will be very important, that the work of the initiative, which we have launched the discussion on Monday, will be something, an inclusive and collective discussion among the partner countries, and that we can collectively craft what we would like to achieve in IPEF. Because I think this process of inclusiveness will be one of the very important aspects of to make this IPEF a success. Now, currently, we have to create some substance, but I think there's, a opportunity there, and we really, hope, that can lead to a more friendly political atmosphere in Washington for trade in the near future, so that, finally we can also draw, the US in FTAs and EPAs.
And you want to add, or?
No, as for me, I'm happy to have Hirose-san have the final word. That's the word that I would have said.
Well, we still have a few minutes. Candy, do you want to add?
No, I just hope that we can echo the same comments. I think, Professor, your concern around, whether IPEF can really hold up over time, right? I think it's something that's sort of incumbent upon all of us, partly this panel, to continue to pursue, in the many forums that we have in order to continue to encourage the framework and the discussions moving forward, and recognize that it's still going to be difficult in any of these negotiations. We know that. I'm hopeful, frankly, that maybe starting with some of the topics near and dear to our heart, but I know near and dear to Japan as well, digital, where we know the digital economy is so critical. Some of these areas where there may be more consensus early on, I hope we sort of think about that and try to move forward with showing some progress in that overall framework. Because I think what is different than, and certainly being highlighted, is that we don't have to do it in the totality. Now, that may be easier said than done. But I'm hopeful that maybe we pick a few of these key topics and where we think there's more consensus and try to get to some conclusions, because that will then show that there's value in the framework and we can keep moving on it. So that would be my thought around process going forward.
Okay. The last few minutes, I'd like to come back to this like-minded nations, or the authoritarian versus democracy, or the decoupling of the US and China. And so as Hirose-san mentioned, that in Asia, it's not that clear-cut, authoritarian and democracy. And as you go, the list of countries which abstained in the UN resolution of condemning Russian invasion, there are a group of countries who abstained, and not to mention the 5 countries who voted no. How, as Hiroshi alluded, how can we get those sitting on the fence countries get to our side, the democracy side, and the more free information minded, trustworthy camp? Any idea?
If I could jump in, and here I agree with Secretary Blinken, who delivered an important speech today. It's not a question of forcing countries to choose between China and the United States. It's providing a choice for countries, providing opportunities for countries, and helping shape the environment in a way that is attractive to those countries.
Candy?
Yeah, no, I concur with Dan. I think in the end, it's offering an alternative that holds up, right? Not just talk, but that is something that other countries will want to engage in. And I think it's probably incumbent upon us to actually conclude some of these pieces, so that then there's a willingness to say, well, that's a standard that I'd like to be part of. And so sometimes you just have to show the action rather than just having the discussion, and then there'll be a willingness to choose, as Dan said.
Great, thank you. So Hirose-san, you have last word in 1 minute.
Thank you very much. Well, touching on the last question, I also agree, that the answer should be to give alternatives, to give choices. And one footnote on that is that what we are hearing from the developing countries is that, in the latest crisis in the last 2 or 3 months, I think the energy prices has gone up, the food prices have gone up, and that is especially, I think, impacting the economic and society of the developing countries. And so I think, giving something tangible, some alternatives for their security, energy and food and so on, will be something, a very good subject of international coordination, so that we can have developing countries on board. And we hope that and finally, Dan has mentioned about the Japan presidency of the G7 next year, and I think we are ready to act as the member of the G7, but at the same time as a member of Asia. And we have, I think, a unique position, and we will make every effort, that we can contribute to, so that the world will not end up in some kind of division, and they have a good coordination among among a variety of countries. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, time has run out, so I move to closing remarks. Thank you all for joining us for this wonderful keynote and panel discussion. We have certainly learned a lot, and I'd like to extend our special thanks to Minister Kobayashi and our panelists. This is a great opportunity for us to hear your insights on questions surrounding economic security and policies on the matter. And of course, we once again thank our corporate and individual sponsors for their support in these difficult times. It means so much to us. If you haven't already, I recommend you register for the last day of the conference on our website. And thank you very much again for joining us, and please take care. Thank you.